So I will hit record now so that I have that. So yes, so anyway, sorry, I've just got the chat here as well. Yes, so we'll go through what habits are, what ones are helping and hindering you, and then also how to actually change and replace them. And I'll try not to get too much stuck into the technical there because I can go down a rabbit hole. So the first thing I always like to go through is the general mindset formation cycle. So this part I find is really important because how our habits are actually formed, and you may or may not have delved into this, but I'll go through sort of how I see the whole thing fitting together. And if you've ever read Atomic Habits by James Clear, some of this will be familiar to you as well. Because when I read that book, I was like, oh my goodness, it was already on that path, and I thought, wow, this is really, really good. This languaging fits right in with what I do as well. So we all have our sense of self, our unique, beautiful, wonderful selves, which quite often we don't acknowledge enough. So we have that sense of self, which we are constantly developing and working on anyway, because as human beings, we evolve. Then with that sense of self comes a set of beliefs. And these beliefs may or may not serve us, and they may or not even be accurate, but they're there nonetheless. And I'll go into what I mean by that once I've gone through the whole thing. From those beliefs, we have behaviors. So the way we see ourselves, like our identity, then the beliefs that support that identity, we then behave in a way that supports those beliefs that support the identity. And with that, the repeated behaviors and the thoughts that go on create our habits. That then reinforces that sense of self or that identity. So that's where that reinforcement happens. And this goes around and around and around until something happens to interrupt it. Quite often, an interruption could be a major, health scare, some trauma, something happening to a loved one, having a child, something that's so it's generally a big life experience that happens that actually interrupts the loop. It could be a slow burn as well, because sometimes there's just this niggling thing that goes in our minds. You're like, just something, just dissatisfaction. And that builds and builds and builds. Because I know that happened to me, that my first probably interruption of this reinforcement loop was frustration, because I wasn't where I wanted to be. I wasn't getting paid well in the job that I was in. And I just kind of like got so frustrated. I like blurted it out at dinner with friends. And thankfully a friend who was there heard what I was saying and was like, oh, is that what you want? I have a friend who's looking for blah, blah, blah. And then bingo, my trajectory changed quite dramatically. So it's interesting what happens to actually interrupt it. Something else that can interrupt this reinforcement loop is somebody questioning your beliefs. Somebody actually saying, why do you believe that to be true? The amount of times when I'm working with clients where I hear them say something and I was like, yes, but I hear the words coming out of your mouth saying you believe this, but your actions based on what you've done in your life is this. It doesn't match up. You've already disproved some of these beliefs, but they're so embedded up here that quite often they don't even actually match the outcomes we've achieved. Somehow we've managed to circumvent this without even realizing it. And it takes a whole lot of focus to be able to realize it, or somebody to actually come in and go, wow, that's awesome. How did you do that? And then if somebody's aware of your beliefs, they go, well, then that belief doesn't match. Like I've got a client who English is not her first language. She and her husband have built up a successful, profitable business in a relatively short period of time. And yet she tells me she's not good at math. And I was like, well, you are, because you've managed to navigate in a foreign language, in a foreign country, all the things that you need to do in order to set up a business and run a business and deal with an accountant and make sure that you understand your profit and loss, all of that, but you don't think you're good at maths. So it's really interesting how when we start to question these beliefs, that's not the topic of today's talk. We're talking about the habits, but the beliefs are really core to it as well. So once we then get to the habits, they're quite often the things that we do over and over, which I will get a bit more into next once my button works. There we are. So what are actually habits? Again, they come down to what we believe. So there's the beliefs that impact our habits, the thoughts that we repeat in our mind about the way we think we are based on our beliefs, and then also the behaviors, so the repeated behaviors. Now, habits in themselves are actually pretty important to when you think of our brains and what information is thrown at us every single day, the types of tasks, our lives have just sped up. We all kind of had this like slowdown during the pandemic, but I feel like since then it's all just sped up even faster. And habits are a really good way to help support us so that we can actually curate what we focus on, and then use our brain power on that rather than all of the repetitive stuff. And this is where technology can really be handy. And I'll touch on this today as well, the level of automation that can happen to help you with your habits as well. And then again, I learned the term, I used to just say connect habits to another habit, which we'll talk about too. But James Clear talks about habit stacking, which I thought was really, really cool, which is, oh, sorry, I just realized there's somebody else who wants to come in. I'll just let them in, where it's you connect one habit to another and it just sort of works together. Like, for instance, drinking water never used to be a habit of mine, but I used to keep it right next to my bed. I would have another bottle right next to the kitchen sink. I would have another one right next to my toothbrush, because cleaning your teeth is one of these habits that kind of gets embedded in you when you're a child. So a lot of the time I used to put post-it notes or things next to my toothbrush because I knew I'd brush my teeth. So whatever I wanted to do, I would connect with brushing my teeth. And then once that habit became a habit in and of itself, I didn't need to put it next to my toothbrush anymore. So now, because drinking water is such a habit, I put things next to my water to remind me. And then, like, taking vitamins, I used to always put them next to my water because I'd forget to take them. Anyway, you get my meaning. And I'm sure if you've delved into habits at all, you're probably not too unfamiliar with that concept. So let's look specifically now at money habits. Now I'm going to focus on business money habits, and then I'll also focus on personal. But firstly, with money habits as a business owner, understanding your numbers is a really big thing. And when I talk about numbers, it's the numbers that shift the dial. It's the sales or the products that have the most sales. It's where your leads are coming from, which ones are converting. There's a certain numbers and metrics, excuse me, that you need to know. And these aren't necessarily the ones that your accountant will follow. These are business ones, not necessarily the sort of profit and loss or accounting type numbers. Those ones you need to know too, but quite often I find they're a little bit distracting because they're paper numbers. They're not necessarily directional numbers that help you understand how you actually are going financially. And this works in the personal sense as well, but I'll get to that in a moment. So understanding how to then set aside time, and time is a big hurdle for habit setting and habit keeping. Because one of the biggest excuses I often hear is, I don't have time to do this or time to do that. Well, once you put it in your calendar and it's there and it's locked, and you don't sort of underestimate, or you don't undermine that time, it will be there, and you do it every month. Like, I do it every quarter. Some things I do on a monthly basis, some things I do on a quarterly basis. And it might sound a little bit boring, I'm repetitive, oh, I've got to do this all the time. But after a while, it just becomes something you do. Then you take the information and you move forward. It doesn't become this big exercise, and the thought behind doing it is bigger than the actual task itself. Sometimes, when I'm having a discussion with my daughter, it's like, you would have done it already and you're still negotiating with me. You may as well just do it rather than going around circles talking about it. So setting time aside is a big thing. And then looking at cash flow. When I say cash flow, I'm also talking about budgeting, which I won't go into here because that's again another big topic, and it's something that can be a little overwhelming as well when you start. But once you actually just set it all up and you're just looking at your numbers every month and you're just checking them, it becomes a lot easier to do. So habits sometimes feel a little bit, take a bit of an effort to set up, but then when you figure out what the maintenance of the habit is, it actually can be a lot easier to keep going than it is to actually not do it in the first place, because we spend probably more time and effort worrying about it than it is to actually then do it once we've got it going. So setting up time with your accountant even. So there are certain things that your accountant will be doing, and the bookkeeper as well, that you need to understand. And finding the right accountant is another big thing. The ones who actually are capable and like to explain things is another part of it too. So this is where getting the right people in your team is important. Yes, love Atomic Habits. Sorry, I just read the chat there, saying Carolyn, yes, absolutely. So I'll get into some Q&A as well. So please write them down if you have some questions. Now, so for personal money habits, this one is a big one as well. There are so many different things. Like I was saying to Carolyn beforehand, I will try and narrow it down because there are lots of different things that you could do. But I don't want to overwhelm anyone with what I'll go through today. One of the first things I often see though is that concept of being a spender rather than a saver. Everything in our modern world is geared to making us spend. even the concept of talking about inflation and interest rates are very much geared around that. How we actually navigate this and how we see ourselves. And it's not even that linear. Like when I deal with clients and, because inevitably as a small business owner, there's a partner involved at some point as well, especially in the personal finances side. And they're like, oh, my partner sees that I'm the spender, or my partner is the spender and I'm the saver. It's important to recognize that identifying yourself as that will mean that your beliefs, your behaviors, and your habits will support it. So you get what you're focused on really as well. So recognizing also that there are sometimes when we spend a bit more and there's sometimes when we want to save, and it depends what we are actually wanting. And this is where clarity really makes a big difference too. Just as an example, I have my last car I got when I was, well, I don't know how old I was because I would have to do the math, but I had it for 20 years. I bought the car when it was 2 years old, and I used to get teased constantly from my friends because I had, oh, the same old little green car. And I was like, yes, I've still got it. It gets me from A to B. Would I like a new one with electric windows? Yes, but yeah, it's a car. It does its job. It has good air conditioning, and I live in Queensland where you need that, so that's fine. But I could see every time I took it to the mechanic that bit by bit things were starting to go bigger and bigger things were starting to go wrong. And I thought soon I'm going to spend more on this car than it's worth. So I gave myself 2 years to save for the type of car that I wanted. And I drive a little Corolla, so nothing fancy. And I thought I'm going to need that 2 years at least to sort of save up incrementally so because I want to just buy the car. Again, my accounting brain says, depreciable asset, da, da, da. Anyway. So what do you know? 2 years of saving, the car finally died. And I had the money there to go buy another secondhand car, a much newer one with lots of fancy things. Like I now have electric windows and mirrors and all sorts of things, which I know for most people is pretty normal, but for me it was quite luxurious. So I made the intentional decision in that particular case to be a saver. I wanted to save for the car rather than just take out a loan. And then the same thing goes with anything that's like a buy now, pay later. We get so used to getting things immediately. And in some cases, things might happen that we don't expect. When we first bought our house, within, I think it was 6 months, the dishwasher broke, the pool pump broke, the laundry, what's it called? The washing machine broke. Oh, hang on. That's in here. And so many things. And thankfully, I had money set aside to pay for a lot of those things. But if you don't, sometimes you need to spend a bit to kind of get things back up to scratch. And that's part of learning how to structure your money as well. So that's a habit too. So trying to avoid using loans or credit for smaller items. Obviously, if you're buying a house or an investment property, it's going to take way too long. I actually had one friend many years ago, and she's the only person I've ever known who's had the discipline to do this, but she spent her entire life renting, but saving. When she retired, she bought a townhouse. And I remember looking at that going, wow, that's incredible. Whether it was the best decision or not, I have no idea, but it was still an incredible result for her. And simplifying expenses and doing it's amazing how there's spend creep that happens, because that happens to me too. Every 6 months, sometimes 12 months, depending on how time flies and what's going on, I will go through and look at all of my expenses and what's kind of come in. Some things are duplicated, or some things I just don't use. I've bought this subscription, I'm not using it, so I might get rid of it. And it's just credit rating, if you're talking about a credit rating, Helen, yes. If you don't have a credit rating or you're trying to improve your credit rating, yes, having a small loan and paying it off quickly is good. Especially if you've got credit card debt, you can even do like balance transfers. And if you can do that and pay it off within the interest-free period or as quickly as possible, yes. So credit score is a slightly different kind of concept to just generally being able to save. But if you've never had a loan and you need to build up a credit score, then yes, that is important. When I bought my husband and I bought our house, I'd only ever had, I think, 2 credit cards, and I didn't have much of a credit score really behind me. But because I'd at least had those and I'd paid them off regularly, then at least that demonstrated that I could actually buy it. Plus, I'd rented for many years prior to that, and I never had any defaults or anything. So even that impacted my credit score as well. So yes, credit scores are part of our lives, and having them is important as well. But yes, back to the expenses and simplifying them and even renegotiating. Like we often think, whatever we pay our providers is it, but it's amazing the latitude they have in order to actually negotiate, especially insurance companies. So I often spend about between 30 and 45 minutes on the phone with my insurance company every year and negotiate a lower price. And they often do it without even having to go and ask a manager. Like I'm always amazed. And talking to your kids as well. My daughter, well, I mean, she hears a lot about money anyway, just because of my business. But she's got her jam jars and she's very savvy. She's constantly looking at ways to make extra money. And Mum, if I do this, will you pay me? Or who will pay me money to do this? And she makes necklaces, and we're going to go have a market stall so that she can sell her necklaces and a few other things. So we'll see how that goes. We haven't done that yet. But yeah, so I love that her brain is already thinking about making money, not just about spending it. Fun fund. So getting into the habit of saving into a fun fund. I call it fun. You could call it whatever you like. I used to call it travel and photography because they were my main two passions. Now it's kind of a bit broader. But it's absolutely essential because another thing I find often happens if we're feeling like we're scrimping and saving for so long, we'll end up busting out and going beyond our budget on a much too regular basis. So if you at least have a fun fund and you can see money there growing that you can just splurge, like if you want to go out with the girls for a night, or you want to go have some drinks, or you want to go to the theater, or you want to go on a holiday, you've got some money that's sitting there that's allowing you to do that guilt-free. So that's important as well. So how do we replace habits? And I've deliberately used the word replace rather than start. Starting habits is an extra level of effort. Replacing an existing habit is easier. I'm not saying it's easy, it's easier because we have something to work with. It's a little bit like, having to write an essay on a blank screen and just going, where do I start? That's often what used to hold me back from journaling, was just like a blank page. And then I used to just start with a word, any random word. I would actually used to very, strangely, I would just open the dictionary and I would pick a word. And that used to just tell me. Now I don't need that anymore, but that's the way I started. So, and this is an activity. You can start to do it now if you like, but I would highly recommend you do this in the near future, because while it's fresh in your mind, but start to make a list of the things that you do with money. And even if something comes up that's not related to money, that's okay too, because this is just an exercise in getting you understanding how your habits are working specifically, and then how you can start to improve them. So just pen and paper, write a list down, however many come to you is fine. And then just brain dump. For instance, do I pay my credit card bill on time every month? How many copies do I buy? And that's not to say you've got to get rid of them. This is just writing them down, because it might just be some of them. You're like, no, I really need that. I need to make sure that I budget that into my whole cash flow budget. Because when I hear this, people say, oh, do without your coffee. I'm like, yes, but if that's the thing that you really love, then surely there's something else you can cut out so that you can keep your coffee. I'm like that with chocolate. I don't drink coffee, but I really like good dark chocolate. I'm like, if I'm going to spend $15 on a 100-gram block of chocolate, I don't want to feel guilty about that. I can do without something else. So write down all of the habits that you have in relation to money or anything. Then prioritize the top 3 that you think are going to have the most meaningful impact on your life. So things like paying a credit card off on time, or understanding which one to pay off first. In your business, it might be getting into the habit of paying some of your bills, or consolidating some of your bills, sitting down, setting the time aside to actually review your numbers on a monthly basis. And when you do that, maybe that's a habit that you need to put in. And if you're not sticking to it, figure out why. Maybe look at what's happening around you at the time of the month that you're scheduling it. If something's happening, before that's running over, that's causing you to not do it, maybe schedule it earlier in the day. Are you a night person? Because this is also really important too. Quite often we try to change or replace a habit at a time of day when we're just not at our best. I'm actually better more in the afternoon, evening than I am first thing in the morning. I've had to become a bit more of a morning person since having my daughter. But once she goes to bed, I could go for hours. I have to almost like force myself to go to bed. I even have a reminder in my phone to remind me to get ready to go to bed, just because if not, I would keep going. So you figure out the time of day that things work for you. And whenever you need to make some changes to your habit, do it at that time of day, because then you've got the most energy. And there's that concept of willpower that comes with it as well. It does tend to fade. So figure out what time of the day you have the most willpower and the most energy to do anything that you need to do, and place more energy on. Consistency. Consistency is key. When it comes to money, consistency is probably one of the biggest thing. I mean, in business it is as well too, but consistently putting money away, it doesn't matter as much how much you put away, but it does matter that you're doing it on a regular basis and then not eating into it. Quite often I hear stories where they're like, oh, I had all this savings and then something happened, my son had an accident or something happened and I needed to dig into that money and it was gone again. And it's like, okay, well then maybe you need another few funds that you're saving into, and then working on the beliefs around it as well. So this is where the mindset side then has to support the habits and the beliefs around money too. But that consistency, and I do have their 30 days, although there are studies now that suggest that it's actually probably more likely 60 to 90 days where we need to be doing the same thing in order for it to be embedded as a habit. And if you're starting one from scratch, absolutely, it has to be more like 90 days. Because if not, then it's going to be too easy to fall back into a previous habit. At the moment, I'm trying to get into a habit of meditating every day. It's not going quite so well. I am getting into the habit of going to bed at the time I want to go into. So I've managed to get that one. It's not, I don't think it's embedded yet, but it's getting close. Whereas the meditating is just not there yet, because I haven't figured out the optimum time of day. So none of us are infallible when it comes to all of this, but we really have to work on how our systems operate the best, which is why, these one size fits all, or everybody has to do this in the morning, or everyone has to do this at night. It doesn't really work, because we all operate slightly differently, and everyone's 24 hours is different as well. If you've got young children, if you've got grown-up children, if you've got grandchildren, if you've got a business, if you're a salaried worker, your whole day changes depending on what you need to do. Automation. This is something that really has made things a lot easier to do, but you need to know what you're doing or you're automating first. If you have a steady income, automating is easier. If you don't, then you've got to calculate based on a percentage every month. So if you've got income that fluctuates, then I use what I call like a money pie. So you have percentages for the different pie slices, and once you've calculated your percentage based on that pie slice for that month, then you can manually do the money transfer. So the actual automation part of it is really more a manual work, but you're actually doing that payment. If you've got a steadier income, then you can automate a certain amount of money every month that gets transferred from your main bank account into I have about 5 different personal bank accounts, and I have about 4 different business bank accounts, just to move the money around so it's earmarked. It sounds complicated, but once it's there and set up, it's actually much easier to run, because then you can see clearly what all the money is for. And then you can automate reminders as well. So if you want to remind yourself to, check your investment balance if you have investment, or check your BAS lodgements happened, because the amount of times I hear from clients that their accountant hasn't lodged their BAS, their business activity statement, on time. I had one client who, it was 2 years worth of BASs that hadn't been lodged, and 3 years worth of tax returns that hadn't been lodged. And because of that, there was a tax debt that had built up as a result, which then they took about 5 years to pay off, because, trying to pay off 2 years worth of tax over, immediately was just not possible. So there's all these sorts of things. We can put reminders in our calendars to do these sorts of things. And then it makes it a little less of a brain task to, I need to remind myself to do that. You can repeat the reminder as well. I have the recurring reminders in my phone for so many things. I have task lists and everything as well. And I even have a project management software I use too, called Trello. So it's quite a task after a while, but once it's running, it runs really well. One thing I would like to also point out is that all of this is incremental and iterative. So you will try something, and if it works, great, keep going with it. But sometimes it's a step back a bit and then it goes forward again. So everything that we do in our lives is step by step, especially when it comes to money and mindset. We're not going to get to the goal straight away. And the thing is, we take one step, we get a little bit more information about what either does and doesn't work. We then take another step. Now we've got that extra information, and the steps might go all over the place, and our goals may also change over time as well. So it's important once we're on the journey to stop for a moment, turn around and look back. There's a really good book called The Gap and the Gain by Dan Sullivan and Dr. Benjamin Hardy. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend you read that as well, because this is a visual sort of representation of what that book talks about, where it's very much looking at how far we've come, acknowledging we have a ways to go, because as humans, and especially if we've got goals and plans, we want to progress forward, but we also need to recognize where we've come as well, because that will help us, give us that confidence and the motivation to keep on going. Because sometimes it just feels hard. We get up in the morning, or, the bank account doesn't have the amount of money in it that we'd like it to have. We just like, why does this just feel so hard? So we just need to recognize where we've come and then what we need to do step by step to get where we need to go. This is something I hear quite a lot. I absolutely love it. You only fail if you quit. So this is, I have to admit, I had a bit of a love-hate relationship with this when I heard it, and sometimes I still do. Like when I'm in a good day, I was like, yes, let's keep going. This is motivating. And on a not so good day, it's like, oh my God, but it's just so much energy and so much effort, and things don't always work the way you anticipate them to. Some things just fly along and other things don't. You can't figure out why. But ultimately, if we do stop what we're doing, especially if we have a passion for what our business is and the things that we want to do and the life that we want to have, it's worth keeping going. Because if we do stop, then we won't achieve it. So the word failure is, it sounds quite finite, but it's really meant to say that also through the failure, we learn. And that's where we just keep on going, and we don't actually quit. We just learn from it and keep on moving and moving. So I'll open up for questions in a moment, but this is what we've gone through. So what are your money habits? And then helping you to understand what ones are working for you and which ones aren't. And that's where you also then prioritize the ones that you want to work on too. So if you take out a piece of paper, if you haven't already, and start to write all that down, and even if not, if you feel comfortable to share what's going through your mind, I would be very happy to. I'm just going to see if I can see people's faces. For some reason I can't seem to see faces. Maybe there's no cameras on. But yeah, if you're happy to share, please feel free to share anything that you've got from this so far, and any questions that you have.
It might be the way that you're viewing it, Alpha. That's why you can't see us, because I can see.
Oh, I can see you now. There we are. Yeah. Okay. Oh, there we are. I pressed that before and it didn't work. Right. Got you all. So yeah, so any questions or anything that's come up for you in this process? And it might be that things start to sort of just enter your mind as you go, because there's a lot of things when it comes to habits that are, they sometimes feel very intangible, and in terms of what we should actually be doing, but it might be worth noting down. And I know that sounds a little bit weird, but a bit like a time audit, a bit of a habit audit as well. So as you go through your day, or when you get a bill, what happens through your mind as you get it and you're going through it? At the end of every month, if you've got a business and you go through the things that you need to go through, what do you do? What do you find is happening on a regular basis? Because it's the things that are recurring on and on. And it's the thoughts that we're thinking about money on and on. So this isn't just about the physical habits, but it's also about the mental habits and the mental thoughts and the cycle that goes around, which is why I'm wearing my Be Kind earrings, because quite often we get quite hard on ourselves when we think about these sorts of things, because it's almost easier to be hard on ourselves than to do the work to progress, because it's so easy to say, oh, but how? Because I know myself, this was a question I used to ask myself all the time. I was like, okay, but how do I do that? Like, how do I get clarity on this? How do I? And sometimes it's just a matter of doing one thing after another. And so I just saw the chat. Yes, Ben Creep, it's real. And at the moment in particular, I find, because everything, like I one of my I go through waves when it comes to self-care. And I bought in the Boxing Day sales last year, I bought some floats, there's the mineral floats that you can do. And I'd done that the same the year before in their Boxing Day sales. And the year before, I got 3 floats for $99. This last year, I got 2. So I was like, right, there's different. Yes, I know. I never thought I would love floats, but a friend got me a voucher, and then I realized, oh my gosh, I actually really love them, and I was so surprised. But yeah, but even for that, I'm getting less for the same amount of money than I did only a year ago. So even if it's not just like buying more stuff, it's just the cost of things. Like I go to the supermarket and I walk away with a bag of groceries, and I'm paying way more than I ever used to. So it's understanding how to minimize that as well. Yes, rating savings. That is a big one. So there's a couple of things that I would suggest looking at when it comes to this. Are you clear on what you're saving for, first of all? Like, are you saving for a thing, or are you just putting money aside because it's something you're supposed to do? That would be one of the first things, because I often find people dig into their savings when they're not clear on what they're saving for, which is why I have so many different personal bank accounts. Um, Yes, yep, making them harder to access is another part of it. So you could put some away, and I'm not a huge advocate of term deposits, although at the moment the interest rates aren't too bad. But even putting them away into somewhere like that, but having them harder to access, having them clear as to what you're saving for, and then having an emergency fund or a rainy day fund or a buffer, whatever you want to call it. I know some people don't like the word emergency because it sounds terrible. But having a fund that's specifically for oh my gosh, something's just happened, I need to pull in there. Or like, for instance, I had at one point harder to access. Well, you could make it in a bank like that you can't physically go into. Unfortunately, online's made it a lot easier now. Um, you could take the app off your phone, just literally make it a step harder to actually, like, you've actually maybe got to open up the program on your computer to log in. Apps on the phone make it so easy to transfer money. So take it off your phone. Remove that. Try and figure out what extra step you would need to do that would make you think twice about doing it. So term deposit is one way of like physically locking it away, but one of the other reasons I'm not a big fan is you can't add to it. So it's just this one piece of money that's like sitting there. And then all of a sudden you get all this money when it comes back again. You're like, yay, I've got all this money. And it disappears. Whereas getting disciplined enough to incrementally put it aside into a high interest bank account. I recently actually switched to Ubank because I find their rates and their what do you call it? Like the steps you have to go through in order to earn the bonus interest are a lot less than some of the other banks. So I've now just put it there, but it is really easy to access. So if I needed to, I would just take the app off my phone, and then I would have to actually, and then don't do the whole like save your password thing in your browser and your computer. So you actually had to go like, oh, I've got to go look at my what are my username apart, like make an extra step that makes it harder to get to. That you a step that you wouldn't like do, or if you went to do it, you'd be like, why am I doing this? And that would just break your sort of concentration enough to go, okay, well, I'm not going to do it now. I'll find another way. So the first thing is also having the clarity to put that money into something specific, but then have an emergency or a rainy day or whatever fund you need, so that if you do need to delve into it, then you've got that money there. So it is a certain level of discipline and that habit. And then even if you maybe have a lot of money in that rainy day fund, and then another like a fun fund. And if you're saving for something in particular, whether it's a holiday or a car or something bigger, then just increment. So it is splitting it out, but it does make it less likely that you're going to dig into those accounts, especially if you've got your emergency fund there and you've got to calculate the amount that you're aiming for. And that can be about, I know people say 3 months worth of living expenses. I like to say 6 months just because it feels a bit nicer and safer. But that again is dependent on what works for you. Does that help? Yeah. Okay. Anything, if it's a habit that it's a good habit that you're trying to implement, make it as easy as possible to do. Link it to another one, remove the boundaries or remove any friction with it. If it's a habit that you want to make harder to undo, put as many obstacles in your way as humanly possible. So for instance, I know this is one of mine is chocolate, because I like to have a little bit of chocolate after dinner. And so what I started to do was actually putting a glass of coconut water, because coconut water is still sweet. We put a glass of coconut water in front of the fridge where we've got like a wine fridge where I keep the chocolate in front of it. So I'd be like, okay, I'm gonna have that instead of the chocolate. Sounds silly, but it actually worked because grabbing the coconut water that was already there was actually easier than opening the fridge and trying to choose which chocolate and then pulling a piece out. So whatever you can do to smooth the path to do the habit that you want to do is the easiest way to do it, which is why automating paying your balance off of a credit card every month. Like if you can do that so that it automatically comes out of your bank account so you don't have to physically pay it, that's great. Automating, excuse me, putting money into a savings account is easier. Micro investing is another really good one. So I signed up for one of the micro investing accounts that does roundups about 6 years ago. And literally every time I spend anything on my credit card or bank any of my cards that I've linked to it, it just rounds it up and invests it. 6 years later, and probably, sorry, I should caveat, 5 years later, I had about $5,000 in there. I then did an automated transfer of $10 a month to top it up. So it's like, I'll just see what happens. $10 a month, I won't even notice it. And within a year, it has gone to $6,500. Like it's amazing the level of compounding. And this is money that's just sitting there that I would have not even noticed because it's literally rounding up cents and then collating it and then investing it. So it's things like that. So I don't even see it because it automatically comes out of my account. I've now set up a micro investing account for my daughter. She's 8, and I have another investment for her as well that will just kind of tick along. And things like that just where you can use that automation, and it's now part of what I do. And then I look at it every month because I'm curious to see what the balance is doing. And it gets really exciting because as soon as we see progress, we get positive reinforcement. So then the habit gets positive reinforcement, and then we're more likely to stick with it. So the more positive we can have, especially around money, then that positivity around one habit will flow into the next one, which will flow into the next one. And that will start to influence the beliefs that we have around money and then our identity around money. And then you'll start to find it just flows a lot easier. And before you know it, you won't be digging into your savings account and you won't even notice. It'll probably take you thinking about it or being reminded of it maybe a year later to go, I haven't had to dig into my savings account for the last year. This is really exciting. And just keep it going though from there. So that momentum and how our minds respond to all of this is really important.